Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our live panel discussion on the Yorkshire cricket crisis. As you know, here at Housing Diversity Network, we work in the housing sector to promote equality, diversity and inclusiveness. But the situation, the things that are going on at Yorkshire cricket at the minute affect us all, and we can all learn from it. The allegations of bullying and racial harassment of former Yorkshire player Azim Rafiq rocked the cricket world last week and plunged the club into a deep crisis. Rafiq's claims have been largely brushed aside, but the minute the sponsors began to cut the ties with Yorkshire County Cricket Club, the cricket authorities sat up and took some notice. Now, I'm joined today by housing professional and cricket campaigner Abdul Ravat, sport lecturer and BBC journalist Nasser Hanif, and HDO CEO Mushtaq Khan. We're going to try and make some sense of the events of the past week and see whether we can learn from it and how we can learn from it in the housing sector and elsewhere. Nasser, could I ask you to start off? Could you give us a bit of a background to the story and what you see as the salient points here?
Yeah, I'm speaking here in a capacity as a freelance reporter. Just to clarify, I work for the BBC, of course. But I guess the timeline of this story dates back to September 2020, really, when we first heard or we first got wind of an article in which Azim Rafiq, former under-19 captain for England and of course Yorkshire player, and he claimed institutional racism at the cricket club, and he says in that initial interview that it left him close to taking his own life. And that's the starting point, I guess, of this whole series of events. If we can sort of go through them, I'm not going to go through the whole lot, but I'll sort of summarize the sort of key points or the salient sort of points. So Yorkshire launches an investigation into these particular claims, and the chairman at the time, Roger Hutton, says the club is going to carry out a wider review. He talks about a wider review of the whole policies and the culture at the club. It asks an independent law firm to take sort of head of that investigation, and Rafiq at the time, going back in time, is hoping that there will be some meaningful change after giving his first statement to that inquiry back then. We're talking 2020 here. It then sort of following on from that, there's then the first sort of, I guess, if we can put it, the first sort of difference of opinion, if I can put it that way, divergence of story sort of emerges from that point, because Azim then files a legal claim against Yorkshire, claiming discrimination, harassment on the grounds of his race. He also talks about victimization as well. And then Yorkshire follows this up in the following year, 2021, by threatening a lifetime ban for anyone who's made any threats against Rafiq. Got an employment tribunal case between Yorkshire and Azim ensues. No real sort of resolution in that. That's followed by this independent investigation, which Yorkshire receives, the findings of this independent investigation into the actual allegations, the racism allegations that I guess are at the core of this whole story. And 2 days after this, we're going into August 2021 now. The England and Wales Cricket Board asked for a copy of this. Yorkshire, yet to release the findings of this, admit or say that Rafiq was the victim of inappropriate behaviour. No detail as to what that inappropriate behaviour, and they say they offer him some profound apologies. At this point, Azim again accuses Yorkshire of downplaying the racism by calling him the victim of inappropriate behaviour. Yorkshire essentially laying the blame at his favour. Then at this stage is what we have, I guess, the bigger picture in terms of the politics of it getting involved, and you get parliamentarians sort of getting involved because MPs start telling the county that they've got to publish the findings of this report immediately. Yorkshire then releases the findings of the report, but Rafiq, which says that Rafiq was the victim of racial harassment and bullying, and that 7 of the 43 allegations made by the player were actually upheld by this independent panel. There are now calls for a publication of the full report. This is still not coming through. Rafiq receives what is called is seen as a redacted version of the report. The ECB is still waiting to hear about this report, so no sign of that going on. Yorkshire says it's carried out its own investigation. We're coming quite up now, quite close to November 2021. This is in October, just a sort of a month ago, October 21. Yorkshire says carrying out its own internal investigation after the findings in the report, it concluded that there is no conduct or action taken by any of its employees, players or executives that warrants disciplinary action. October 2021. So that's then. We go into November now. Just this month, the DCMS Select Committee calls on Hutton, this is of course Roger Hutton, the chairman, to appear before it to answer questions about how this whole question was actually handled, how the whole questions of allegations were handled. We have other politicians making remarks, Sajid Javid, the other MPs sort of joining, saying that, you know, heads need to roll, etc., etc. The ECB also at this point says that should be a full investigation. There are sort of rumbles on with other stuff happening. 5th of November, we are now in the month of November. Roger Hutton eventually resigns, and then Lord Kamlesh Patel of Bradford is appointed as director and chair of the club, which pretty much takes us up to the point that we're in now in terms of where we are. Of course, this is followed by further allegations from different players, and of course the recent resignation of Mark Arthur, the chief executive. So briefly, I hope I've sort of summarised that whole story and tried to sort of go through the various bits. But that's pretty much where we can take it to. I mean, the last bit perhaps is the comments by Joe Root, who's sort of made comments whilst he's over in Australia preparing for the Ashes about the issue of racism. And that it is something that needs to be tackled. The issue of racism at Yorkshire needs to be tackled.
Sure. Well, we'll come on to Joe Root a little bit later, but I mean, the full report's not out yet. It's not in the public domain yet, but it's quite clear. I mean, the dominoes are falling up there, and not many people up at the head of Yorkshire, have covered themselves with glory. I mean, Yorkshire is historically one of the most famous counties in the country. It's being accused of being institutionally racist. Abdul, can I ask you, what do you make of that? You're embroiled in Yorkshire cricket. You know a lot about Yorkshire cricket. Is Yorkshire Cricket Club institutionally racist?
That's a very big question, and thanks, Nasser, for that chronology. It reminds me of some of the CRE investigations that we used to read in the past in the housing sector, of housing authorities, just basically not on top of their allocations and procedures, and actually, it needed an external body to basically unlock what was happening. And I think that's one of the issues that, in the eyes of Yorkshire, in the eyes of their processors, they're probably thinking that everything that they've done is above board, everything that the process and procedures they've done are sound. But I think the problem here is that, well, in whose eyes, is the case? I think there are some issues here in terms of openness. There are issues here in terms of transparency, and there are definitely some issues around scrutiny. So I think it's the lack of independence, the lack of independent scrutiny, and all of those. If you look at the process, so for example, the legal representation that Yorkshire relied on were basically the previous firm of their ex-chair, Mr. Hutton. Now, in our world, in our housing world, we would see that as a conflict of interest, whether close or indirect, but we would hope that our organisation and board would steer away from that. So that for me was a complete no-no. I think the fact that there was such a period of time, 18 months, in the process, is another issue. Now, I'm not saying that's all down to Yorkshire, because I'm sure, there's been probably shenanigans being played from all parts, in that respect. But not having a very defined timescales for this, just drag the whole issue for everyone, because people wanted answers. People wanted a fair process, but people wanted to get to the truth of that. That was being kicked in the long grass. And then I think the third thing for me, as Nasser said, is that if you have 7 of the 43 allegations upheld, and you sort of on the one hand apologize, but on the other hand you're saying we're not going to change, we're not going to do anything, we're not going to take any action. Well, that's completely undefendable. So I think for me, the issue about whether Yorkshire cricket is institutional racist or not is I think is a broader question. But for me, the process in which we've gone through leaves a lot to be desired. And then you can sort of chuck in the thing that, well, where was the England and Wales Cricket Board in all of this? You know, they're supposed to be the regulatory body for cricket counties and the game as a whole. You know, so recently there was an incident in terms of financial irregularities with Durham. And actually, ECB came down on them very, very heavily. But because of an issue like this, you know, in terms of the pecking order, that seems to be low down the peg. So then you question: has the ECB got its regulatory remit, you know, proportionate to what the issue is? So this is not just the other thing I'd like to say to start off with. This is not just about Yorkshire. I think this is about grassroots cricket. This is about cricket as a whole. On the one hand, we have a brand which is global and it's growing in appeal. And we've just seen, you know, the audiences, TV audiences in terms of the ICC T20 World Cup. But then you can't have this issue affecting that brand because we can't afford to do that. And there was an incident that happened between the Pakistan and India game, where Mohammad Shami, you know, who bowled the penultimate over, and as a result, you know, Pakistan were going to box that game and were on ahead. But the abuse he got as a result of that for being a Muslim in an Indian team, and when you consider that the BCCI, the ICC, nor his captain, you know, said anything until when the sort of furor from social media was at a fever level. So then you got to wonder, you know, whilst, you know, at the moment Yorkshire is seen as a rotten apple, was not the only rotten apple in the tree.
No. Can I just come back to the ECB though, because you said it's not the only rotten apple. I'm not quite sure. I'm a little bit uneasy as to what the ECB has been doing and what the County Cricket Club has been doing. There's Roger Hutton resigned, and he came out in the press to say that he'd been asking the ECB for help for 18 months. But my question is, what had Roger Hutton been doing for 18 months? Because this is the chairman of the cricket club. Surely the culture comes from the top. And if the culture of the cricket club is rotten, who's to blame?
Well, you've raised a very interesting point in terms of the relationship between counties and ECB. And I think my view is that I think this is uncharted territory for the ECB and to a point for Yorkshire in that relationship. I personally think they were making it up as they're going along because there wasn't nothing intact. Now, in due course, and I'm sure, you know, Tom Harrison is also appearing in front of the select committee on Tuesday. And I think he's got some real questions to answer because he obviously didn't know what the hell was going on. And there isn't that sort of rigor and there isn't that sort of ongoing relationship around these areas, you know, particularly on the back of the South Asian Action Plan that Lord Patel launched, you know, when he was at the ECB. So there's a whole raft of issues for the ECB to answer. But the other issue is that the ECB held up an equity in cricket commission, which it's supposed to be independent. Now, I've looked at the terms of reference of that. They're a bit bleak and they're a bit bland, to be honest with you. They still haven't really established the group. And Cindy Butt's, you know, I'm questioning whether Cindy Butt has the authority and the independence from the ECB to really tackle some of these areas. Now, they've been doing a lot of reactive work since this scandal has appeared, and people aren't stupid. People are going to think, hang on, you're only responding to this because of what's happened. You know, what were you doing for the last 8-9 months? So there's some questions there. So I don't think the ECB, on the one hand, can say to Yorkshire that you've got it all wrong, and fair enough, because of the governing body, they can impose sanctions on that. But who's going to regulate ECB? And that's the question I think that DCSM will no doubt ask next week.
Mm-hmm. And then back to Yorkshire, there's clearly a lack of faith in how Yorkshire have dealt with this situation. How does that leave the county and the county cricket club in relation to the Asian community? What, you know, how's that relationship going to work now?
Well, it's disappointing, because to be honest with you, we've enjoyed a very good relationship, particularly with people like Mark Arthur, who gets this and who understands that for the county to grow in terms of cricket, bearing in mind that a third of all the cricket that's played in this country is done so from the South Asian community. But there is a massive issue in terms of some of the low-hanging fruits that you can do, if you're at the county, and some of the more deeper, entrenched structural issues that actually really make a difference in terms of creating a level playing field. And what I mean about that is looking at, for example, the coaching setup that Yorkshire had in terms of talent management, in terms of coaching pathways, and say comparing that to someone like Warwickshire, where because of the sort of approach that they've taken, the actually flow of children, and young kids from all diverse groups is a lot more healthy than Yorkshire is, even when you consider that there's more cricket that's played in Yorkshire than anywhere in the country. So there are some issues here about the South Asian Action Plan delivery. And Mushtaq knows, and because Mushtaq and I did a sort of preliminary review of the South Asian Action Plan, which we sort of like shared with the England Wales Cricket Board. And what we found on that review at that mid-year point is in so many of those areas, key critical areas, progress has been patchy at the best. And in order to move from that position to the target position of 2024, it's going to create a mountain. So one of the issues there is that who is reviewing the strategy? No one's reviewing the strategy because it's all done. The homework's being marked internally. There is no rigor and external validation, that can suggest where it's going.
Mushtaq, you and I are Lancastrians. So we'll give the Yorkies a break for a minute. I think they need a break. And I grew up playing cricket in the Lancashire leagues and then through the Parks leagues, and there's the 2 or 3 teams that were Asian teams, and we were scared of them because they were fast, they were good, they were better than us. But then as they go through to club cricket and then village cricket and Lancashire League cricket, the representation of the Asian players is just not there at all. And I found myself as an 18, 19-year-old looking around at players that I'm playing with now, and I've played against players at 16 who are far, far better, and they're not here. What's happening in Lancashire? I mean, are we ahead of them over the other side of the Pennines, or have we got places to go as well?
I don't think so. I think cricket participation has declined in the Asian community. I don't think there's enough players that there used to be. I used to play in Asian leagues, and I don't think there's many of them left now as well. But I don't think players from an Asian background have a pathway into better clubs and better organisations, about better ways that they can try and be the best that they can be in the game. I've been doing a little bit of work with some organisations just to make cricket clubs more welcoming to people from the Asian community, because you've got people who are really good players who are excluded from clubs because they don't like the culture there. They don't like the way that, sometimes there's a drinking culture in those clubs. There's an after hours get together after the game and all that sort of stuff, which Asian people probably don't like to be part of. And I still feel that people are excluded. People from the Asian background are excluded from the cricket structures down in the county. And I'm, be interested to see whether it's the same in Yorkshire as well.
So what's the answer? How do we improve that? I mean, is it all the onus of the cricket clubs to change the culture?
I think it's both. I think it's both the cricket club and people have got to try and give and take on both sides. And, I think there's a lot of people who are excluded from, cricket participation simply because they don't like the way or the clubs that hold the roost and make sure that they can be part of that sort of structure.
Yeah.
Just to interrupt, if I can, I did a series of reports over the summer for the BBC where I went around the country actually, just to maybe answer a bit more your question about how widespread is our questions of racism around the country. So I actually went to clubs in the Midlands. I went to Warwickshire, I went to Leicestershire, and I also went to London as well. And it was fascinating actually just to hear different voices and seeing their experiences. So in London, I I went and interviewed people who were at a Tamil-based cricket club, and it was really interesting hearing their relationship. And they had a relationship with Middlesex, and they were actually trying to get some of their players, although they had their own individual league, which is interesting in itself that they formed their own Tamil cricket league. But through that, they were actually having ventures with Middlesex, and they were able to get training with some Middlesex players. So that was quite an interesting, positive movement. But then I heard sort of other stories from Leicester as well, a cricket club I went to in Leicester, Leicester Asians. And they were on the suburbs of Leicester, of the city of Leicester, and they were saying that they got up to a point, but after that point it was quite difficult for them to expand their horizons, and also, you know, it was just seeing how they sort of, their relationship, how that sort of formed with the sort of local county, and whether they had people from Leicester coming. And it was interesting to hear that they, despite having that, they did have a connection with Leicester, and what helped them in the past was having Asian people at Leicestershire itself. So that sort of made that process a little bit easier. And finally, if I can touch, I also crossed over into Warwickshire as well, and I spoke to, there was a Sikh cricket club that I spoke to there called the Khalsa Cricket Club, and they were really interesting as well, because again, you know, that talk about participation, they were relying essentially in terms of grassroots cricket, they were relying on a lot of people, overseas people, who were coming over and working for the local Land Rover plan, who happened to participate in their cricket matches. They were really short of players. What they found, one of the gentlemen there told me, is we get our players up to the age of 18, but then from 18 to about, 28, 30, we lose them, because they go off to university, they are married. So there's no actual structure to their system there. But I just found it intriguing just seeing how the different challenges around the country. And of course, interspersed into that, there were some people who were saying, you know, the difficulties around race, and that was stopping them as well. But it's interesting to see how all these nuances play out around different parts of the country. Yeah,
absolutely. Thanks, Nasser. That's really interesting. And so let's go back to Yorkshire. You mentioned Joe. That's a good question, Maureen. Yeah, so if the cricketer hadn't spoken up, would football fans be aware of what was going on there?
Probably not. You know, probably not. I mean, there has been you know, attempts to deal with dispute resolution, sort of like, you know, offline, so to speak. And I know there are people involved, you know, from various parts of the cricket, you know, so in part, you know, with the sort of blessing of the ECB to get into difficult negotiations that, you know, some South Asian players and others may be experiencing with their counties. But there's no formal process here. There's no formal understanding that, you know, this may be happening because of various, you know, misunderstandings or cultural misunderstanding. So I think the issue now is that the genie's out of the bottle.
Yeah. So okay, so back to Yorkshire. Yeah, Joe Root. I'm a big Joe Root fan. I think he gets criticism as an England captain. He's a wonderful batsman. He came out and made a statement yesterday to condemn racism in all its forms. We stamp it out. He's been good. You know, he's backed the taking of the knee and made sure that the England cricket team are wearing the anti-racism T-shirts. And Nasser, can I ask you, he was asked by the journalist yesterday whether he, in his 14 years experience at Yorkshire County Cricket Club, had heard any examples of racist behaviour or racist language, to which he replied no. Now, was it fair of the journalist to ask that question? He's doing his job. And what do you make of Joe Root's answer?
Well, I guess you're going to see me aligned with the journalist, aren't you? It's my profession. I think journalists have to ask difficult questions. That's part of what they do. Otherwise, we won't be in this process. I'm just looking through the quote itself, and I'm just sort of going through it again myself, actually, before we came on air. And the quote says, so he was asked if there were any issues with racism at Yorkshire. He said, and the quotes are, "Not that I can recall, no, I can't, but it is clear things have happened at the club and we have to make sure we eradicate it. And then he was sort of pressed further, and I think this is the point that you're making, isn't it? I can only speak from my personal experiences. The thing that's really disappointing is that this has happened. We have to find, we have to find a way to move forward.
But is Joe just giving a politician's answer there? Is he fudging it?
I think so, and I guess he's in a difficult situation, but and I guess that's why Azim has responded the way he has, because he wanted him as Yorkshire captain, perhaps. And this is me trying to be Azim now, which I clearly am not, thinking that he needed some support. Perhaps Joe may have witnessed something, and this is the bit we don't know, because we're all sort of making suppositions about what may or may not have happened. So, yeah. Or there could genuinely be, taking devil's advocate, a situation where he may not have witnessed it, but he has heard it third or fourth hand, and he may not have been party to those conversations. But it's all speculative.
It's also partly an interpretation of what is racist language or behaviour and what isn't.
Absolutely. And clearly, what we have certainly witnessed, and there are certain things, and the consensus is quite clear on this. There are certain things, the P word is clearly racist. I mean, that it's not banter. Points made by all, everyone. I'm pretty certain. I mean, it's one of the first things that Lord Kamlesh Patel said at that press conference the other day. It's the family of Azim Rafiq and their banners, which we saw at the weekend at one of the protests, that's the point that they were making. The politicians, whoever you take. I mean, it's interesting that it's united people from left to right, about the use of this particular word in the context of what's gone on.
Yeah. And I mean, Yorkshire and England star Adil Rashid isn't it a bit of slightly invidious position there? As a PR expert would say nothing in this situation.
Yeah.
And we've got to respect Adil, and we've got to respect everybody that's involved in this situation here. Okay, well, we're all cricket fans here. We don't like cricket, we love it, but we need to talk about housing at some point. The scandal, the thing that's rocking the Yorkshire County Cricket Club, it's not just about sport. Is it something that is more symptomatic of how people in power, people in influence behave and how they run organisations, and where do we sit in the housing sector? How good are we in the housing sector at dealing with problems like this? Mushtaq, can I fire that over to you?
So yeah, we've done a report. We did a report last year with the National Housing Federation, for the National Housing Federation. We said that in the housing sector, we don't feel we've made much progress over 30 years. We always have 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Any initiatives that we do are never followed through. There are no champions. There's no leaders in this field. Bits of good practice are few and far between. I think probably 4 or 5 points that I'd make here in the Yorkshire scandal that are probably applicable to housing organisations, because housing organisations also come to us for help and support in this area. I think, first of all, there's a disconnect at Yorkshire between what the organisation says and what it does. And I think that also plays out in the housing sector too. I think in its response to the scandal, the thing that struck me, and again, the housing sector can be guilty of this, is that there's a lot of defensiveness, that they're not willing to try and admit anything or say that, everything is defensive. I know in some of the reports that I'd read that they tried to turn the tables on Azim Rafiq to say, look, he's not a particularly good character. He's done a lot of other bad things. Look at the person here who's talking about it. So there's an element of defensiveness. I think people don't like discomfort and feeling uncomfortable and being told uncomfortable truths. So I think there's an issue around that, which we also hear around housing organisations. Part of the training that we do is helping managers having uncomfortable conversations. And I think if an organisation really wants to tackle equality and diversity, it needs to feel uncomfortable. And if it's not having that feeling, it's probably not doing things right. There's also an issue around specific actions. What are you actually going to do? What are you going to do? Are you going to list out what you're going to do in response? Who's going to be accountable for it, and what are your timescales? And that has also not come out in this response as well. So I think it's a classic case of how not to respond to a racism scandal. Everything that you should have done, you know, they didn't do. They did completely the opposite. So, you know, I was reminded of Starbucks. About 3 years ago, Starbucks had a scandal in America where they removed two black men for trespassing in one of their restaurants. You know, the management had them removed, and they held their hand up straight away. The managing director went to the store. They closed stores in America for racial equality training. They gave some money to black entrepreneurship and things like that. So it's a completely different way of dealing with a similar process. And I just think this has gone completely wrong, and it's still going on. You get a resignation every day, I think, in this Yorkshire scandal. You know, something new crops up, and next week they're in front of one of the parliamentary committees, and no doubt we'll hear more stuff. So, you know, this is just going to go on.
It's early days in the scandal, isn't it? But they have given us a bit of a blueprint as how not to deal with it so far. We'll just have to see what happens from here on in. Well, time's caught up with us. That's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much. And so from the Housing Diversity Network, say thank you to everybody who's listened. Thanks to our contributors here. I'm going to plug a couple of webinars we've got coming over the next couple of weeks. Next Friday, transphobia. It's Transphobia Awareness Week, and Joanne Lockwood, our associate, will be chairing a webinar on transphobia. So that's going to be a well worth event. And then the following Tuesday is the refugee crisis. So those two webinars there. So all that remains for me now is to thank very much Abdul, thank you Nasser, and of course thank you Mushtaq, and wish everybody a very healthy and happy weekend. We've got two questions. Sorry, yeah, let's go. Yeah. Question from Alozi. Hi, Alozi. Is there real accountability in sport when it comes to racism?
Well, I'll have a try with that. Good question. I think there's a recognition that it's not a level playing field, and whilst participation numbers, you know, are healthy within the South Asian community and other groups, you know, even though I think cricket is struggling in terms of overall, you know, position they used to enjoy. I think part of that is the link with school has gone. So like at the grassroots levels, we're doing a lot of work with our local schools to engender cricket again, so that becomes a feeder ground. But I think the real issue is the disconnect between participation numbers, and as you get up into the coaching, as you get up into the counties, and as you get into the board, that's where I think there's a blockage. So I think what needs to happen now, and you know, whether that's forced on the game through the government and wider society, or whether, you know, it wakes up and decides to do something itself, is that accountability at that structure, because clearly this is not working. I mean, the thing for me is that because there wasn't that diversity of thinking, because there wasn't that diversity of thought at that board meetings, you know, several board meetings where this issue was discussing, you know, you sort of start to think, well, did anybody not pick up this issue, that how this would play out and what the connotation, the implication could be? And that, and in a sense, Yorkshire's not alone in this. So if this happened in another county, would they be any better equipped to deal with that? And that's what we've got to sort of find out. So I think it's a very good question, and I think there are areas where real accountability is lacking.
For sure. Do you have another question? Yeah, question from Sharon. Thanks, Sharon. It was the use, I think I used the word, the use of the word banter when we're talking about racial discrimination, and who thinks it's banter, who thinks it doesn't. How can we get away from that? How can we get away from using that as a sort of throwaway, that it's just banter?
So probably I'll kick off this, and other people can answer as well. So whenever I've dealt with an investigation or gone into an organisation, it's always the excuse that it was just banter. I think language has changed over the years, and what's acceptable, what was acceptable 20 years ago is not acceptable now. I think some people don't move on in their use of the language. I think banter is also always a two-way process as well, and quite often the banter that I hear is not banter, it's just one person abusing or using language that they think is appropriate, but in fact it's not appropriate. So I think there's this two-way thing, and the fact that language always changes and language is evolving, and people fail to keep it up with what's acceptable and what isn't. Nasser, Abdul, have you got anything to add on to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's not just cricket, is it? In a lot of other sports, where you've got high competition, high stakes, and different groups of supporters, the line between banter and abuse becomes very thin in that respect. And part of that, I think, at grassroots levels, we get a lot of this, and part of it is actually the officials. The officials need to set the marker, and the officials, if they do not tolerate this, then that will happen. So one of the things that's happened in one of the leagues that we're associated with is that there's been another change in the rule, and the rule is now very specific. The draft rule that we proposed is that in terms of banter, what that means and what it cannot include, and basically what it's done is given that empowerment to whoever feels aggrieved from that to report it out, rather than wait for the endorsement of the umpire, for example, in cricket, so it's only his interpretation. So actually that also then means that the umpires are accountable. So if there are things going on and the umpires have not picked up this and dealt with it on the pitch, then it could escalate.
I would just say, just very briefly, I'd say at the heart of this matter is education. I think education is the key, because if you think about to what Mushtaq was saying a few moments ago, language in itself has history, words have history, words have meaning, and the meaning of those words, and Lord Kamlesh Patel put this the other day, the P word has a particular meaning for a lot of people, certainly a lot of people for the Asian community. It is set in a certain time frame and a certain period, and it means something quite vile to them, because it means being beat up, or it means the threat of violence from skinheads, so on and so forth. And until people who aren't from that background, who don't understand that loaded meaning, they're not going to get the hurt and the harm that these words can actually impact on individuals.
That's a brilliant point. Thank you. Very insightful and brilliant as ever. Thank you, chaps.
Stuart, just that those, you'll know this. Who was the chairman of the FA who resigned because he kept on a Zoom call referring to coloured players all the way through the meeting?
Oh, yes. No, the names escape me. Nasser, yeah.
I'm just trying to think desperately, but I can't.
Yeah, I don't want to be ageist, but he was.
Yeah, so,
he was behind the times, wasn't he?
He used that.
We got Greg, somebody. Greg.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he got in hot water, didn't he?
Yeah.
Well, he had to resign, didn't he? He had to resign.
He did. Yeah.
Greg Clark.
Greg Clark. There you go. Yeah, we'll give him a name check. Well, we have run over time, but it's been well worth it, and the fact that we've run over time is entirely my fault because I'm the chair. So maybe Roger Hutton could take note of that. So anyway, thank you, Abdul, thank you, Nasser, thank you, Mushtaq. Have a great week, everybody.